It all started on a quiet Friday evening at my lake cabin, the one place I considered sacred, my personal sanctuary away from the chaos of being the chief of police in a county where trouble never really took a day off. A place my father built with his bare hands before passing it down to me, a legacy carved into cedar walls overlooking the still, glassy waters of Lake Remington, and I had just settled into my chair with a hot cup of coffee and a folder full of case notes when the knock on the door came, sharp, entitled, the kind of knock that doesn't ask but demands attention, and when I opened it, there stood the very woman the entire neighborhood knew and dreaded. Karen Wilson, the self-proclaimed queen of the wall, armed with her usual scowl, clipboard, and the audacity of someone who believed every square inch of property in the subdivision secretly belonged to her. Except this time she wasn't alone. Next to her stood her son, Chad, a lanky, arrogant 20-year-old who carried himself with the swagger of someone who had never been told no in his life, a frat boy wannabe in designer sunglasses even though the sun was setting, and before I could ask what they wanted, Chad blurted out with a smirk, "We're gonna need your cabin tomorrow night for a party, Chief, so clear out your stuff and don't make this difficult," and for a moment I thought I misheard him, but Karen jumped in, her voice dripping with that condescending tone she had perfected at years of WA meetings. "Yes, officer, this would really benefit the community, the kids need a safe space to gather, and frankly, this cabin is just wasted sitting here under your watch, so be a team player and hand it over for one night," and I couldn't help but laugh, a low chuckle that only seemed to fuel their irritation, because the audacity was almost comical. Here I was, the chief of police, sworn to uphold the law, and they were standing on my porch demanding I surrender my private property like it was a borrowed lawn chair, and I said calmly, "Karen, Chad, this cabin is mine, not the HOA's, not the county's, mine. And you two are trespassing, so I suggest you leave before I add criminal charges to your weekend plans." But instead of backing down, Chad puffed up his chest like a rooster, leaned in, and said, "You think your badge makes you untouchable, old man? Everyone knows my mom runs this neighborhood, and if you don't give us the cabin, we'll make sure you regret it." And that's when I realized this wasn't just teenage arrogance, it was a challenge, and Karen's smug smile confirmed it. So I closed the door in their faces, thinking that was the end of it. But oh, how wrong I was, because the next night as I sat inside with my files, I heard the unmistakable roar of engines and the pounding bass of music shaking the lakeshore, and when I looked outside, I saw a convoy of cars, trucks, and even jet skis pulling up, dozens of kids spilling out, beer kegs rolling onto the dock, lights strung up like a carnival, and at the center of it all was Chad, standing on my porch like a king returning to his castle, shouting, "Welcome to my lake house, everybody." And my blood boiled, because not only had they trespassed, they were now throwing an all-out rager on my property while I was inside, but instead of storming out in fury, I decided to let it play, because as chief of police, I knew sometimes the best way to handle arrogance was to let it bury itself, so I sat back, called in a discreet code to my officers, and waited as the chaos unfolded. The kids trashed my dock, graffiti on the boathouse, bottles smashed on the rocks, and Karen herself arrived an hour later, holding a glass of wine, mingling with parents who clearly knew what was happening, and she even had the gall to wave at me through the window as if I were her hired security, and that's when the plan snapped into focus. I wasn't just going to shut down this party, I was going to make an example out of them, so I called in the full force. Squad cars with lights flashing, breathalyzers, tow trucks for illegally parked cars, boats for kids trying to flee across the water, and when the sirens hit, the crowd froze like deer in headlights. Chad tried to rally them, shouting, "Don't worry, my mom runs the WA, she'll handle this." But when my officers cuffed him for underage drinking, drug possession, and trespassing, his bravado crumbled. Karen screamed bloody murder, waving her WA bylaws like they were holy scripture, shouting that the WA had rights over my property. To which I calmly responded, "The law outranks your WA, Karen, and tonight, the law is here in full force," and I'll never forget the look on her face when the tow truck hauled her Lexus away because she had parked illegally across 3 driveways, or when she tried to interfere with an arrest and was herself threatened with obstruction charges, and the next morning, as the sun rose over a trashed but quieter lakeshore, I stood on my porch drinking coffee while Karen stormed over, red-faced and screeching that I had ruined her son's reputation, that the WA would sue me, that I would lose my job, but before she could finish, a county attorney car pulled up, and out stepped my old friend and ally, State Attorney Lisa Graves, who had already been briefed on the incident, and she looked Karen square in the eyes and said, "Not only does the chief have full authority, but your son is facing multiple charges, and if you keep threatening legal action, I'll happily counter with harassment and trespassing suits against you in the law." And Karen, for the first time in all the years I had known her, was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, and as she dragged her son back toward their house, I thought that was the end, but the twists kept coming, because 2 weeks later, I received an anonymous letter in my mailbox with photographs, grainy shots of me at the cabin, private moments, clearly surveillance, and the message scrawled across the paper said, "This isn't over, the war runs deeper than you think," and my instincts told me this wasn't just Karen anymore. There was a bigger game in play, one involving other board members who had been covering for their kids, laundering WA funds into private accounts, and using the lake properties for under-the-table rentals. So I launched a quiet investigation, pulling bank records, property deeds, and before long, the entire tangled web of corruption unraveled before me, with Karen at the center but not the top. She was just a pawn, and the real players were 2 board members funneling thousands of dollars through WA fees into shell companies, and suddenly, my little cabin confrontation turned into a county-wide scandal, making headlines, bringing down half the WA, and vindicating every neighbor who had suffered under Karen's petty rules. And while Chad ended up with probation, community service, and a permanently bruised ego, Karen herself was voted out of the HOA presidency in disgrace. Her reign of terror finally ended, and as for me, I got to keep my cabin, my peace, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the law doesn't just stop a party, it topples an empire built on arrogance. And though the investigation proved the HOA's corruption ran deep, the greatest satisfaction came from the neighbors who stopped by, one by one, thanking me not as their chief of police, but as their neighbor who finally stood up to the tyranny of entitlement. And while Karen still scowled at me every time our paths crossed, she never again dared knock on my door, because she finally understood a truth she had spent years denying. There are some doors in life you should never try to kick open, especially when the man on the other side has both the keys to justice and the will to use them.